Greetings. I want to dedicate this video to two wonderful people, just a couple of beautiful souls, those being Yakoba and Sister E, as while I was away, they found it in the kindness of their hearts to take time out of their busy schedules and get on social media to ever so sweetly encourage me to return to this subject soon. I thought that was very cool, so I extend my thanks to both. Okay, now on a more serious note, back on December 7th, Kelly Richardson released another video on the subject of the pews at First African Baptist Church. And I must say, the end of the video stood out as quite different from anything which had appeared in any of his previous videos on the subject. You see, over the course of the 14 months which transpired before this particular video, Kelly Richardson had put out or participated in at least a half dozen videos on the subject of the pews, each of them over an hour long, and yet none of them ever getting around to examining the markings on the pews, which, we would think should have been the centerpiece of the discussion. Now, mind you, this video from December 7th also got mired in some off-topic distractions, like speculating about people's motivations and all that. But towards the end, in the last 9 minutes, Kelly Richardson finally did what I and others have been inviting him to do for over a year, and that is he looked at some of the markings and he proposed a string of characters. And, for that reason, I'd like to say thank you to Kelly Richardson for finally getting around to doing that. I do appreciate his effort in that regard. And even better, the particular pew that he looked at happened to be the same pew that I had examined in my video from over a year ago, which had proposed a hypothetical case for Arabic in that pew. And Richardson seems quite pleased with what he proposed vis-a-vis what I had proposed 14 months earlier.
I know if he had any glimpse that he could come against what we put out, especially closing out with that pew that he tried to say was Arabic and prove that he had no clue of what he was talking about.
So in this video, I'd like to look over Richardson's proposed reading for the pew and compare it to a slightly revised version of my, again, hypothetical case for an Arabic reading for that pew. Interestingly, although Richardson is once again declaring that there will be no more discussion, the reality is that the discussion is just getting started. We are just now reaching a point that I had hoped we could have got to about 14 months ago, which is to say, we're finally starting to look at the pews and discuss their different features. Whatever the case, let's begin with a salient portion of Richardson's presentation. Just to be clear, he's proposing that the relevant markings read in Hebrew, Yod Zayin Resh Yod 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 Lamed. And yes, that's a triple Yod, 3 consecutive Yods. But also to be clear, he's proposing this string of characters appears in specifically the Solitreo script. So in these brief clips, you'll see Richardson attempt to give a justification for putting aside most of the markings on the pew. Then you'll see him lay out the precise string of characters that he feels he sees in the portion which he isolated. And then he'll note what precise word he thinks that spells. And then finally, he'll attempt to support his interpretation by running that precise string of characters through an online Hebrew translation site at doitinhebrew.com. So here you go. Take a look.
The first error is assuming that this pew was written by one person. If he would have done the proper analysis on the pew, he would clearly see that there was at least 2 people or 2 different tools used to write cursive Hebrew or soletreo on these pews. If you zoom in on the writings, it's obvious and it is supported. The yellow writings to the left of your screen is me writing out the highlighted section of the pew. Altogether, they are pronounced Yiz-Ray-Il or Is-Ray-Il. Is-Ray-Il. Let's confirm it with the tool Abu describes as unreliable in his attempt to debunk Benaiah Israel.
Let me begin by first thanking Kelly Richardson for finally presenting, a string of characters. I do honestly appreciate it, as that is the most central aspect of the discussion over what appears on the pews. Now, let's start with his assertion that the portions he doesn't want to look at were written by a different person or with a different tool. Now, notice that he didn't present any argument for that position. Rather, he just simply asserted it. And honestly, in the absence of an argument in favor of that claim, I see no reason to accept that premise. It seems to me that it's probably the case that he came up with that line of argumentation simply because he finds those portions difficult to interpret, and thus he wanted to avoid them. While I await further elaboration from Kelly Richardson on this premise, if I had to guess, I would guess that he would probably hinge his argument on the lines being thinner or thicker than others, or having different levels of, opacity. But the truth is, if I were making markings, whether I was using a paintbrush or a knife or a screwdriver or various other tools, I could make lines with different levels of thickness and thinness, and also different levels of impression, how opaque something is, how hard I press, etc. Whatever the case, if we just focus on the stretch of the pew that has markings, right? I'm going to put this in the square here, this rectangle. If we just focus on the portion that has markings, we can see that Richardson cast aside a majority of those markings. The portion he wants to focus on only covers about 38% of this stretch. The portion on the left covers about 24% of the stretch, and the portion on the right covers another 38% of that stretch. So Richardson put aside and ignored more than half of the markings on this pew. He literally ignored most of the markings. He literally ignored most of the pew. Now, in contrast to that, I'm going to represent a hypothetical case for Arabic on this pew, and I'm going to try to incorporate the portions that Richardson ignored. The first thing I want to do is go to Google Images and pull up something to compare the markings to. So I'm going to type in Surat and Nas calligraphy, and I'll just choose this top middle image. So this is the 114th chapter of the Qur'an, the last chapter of the Qur'an according to its current organization. And I'm going to skip past the top portion, which has the basmala and the first verse of the chapter, and I'm just going to focus on this portion right here, which has the second and third verses of the chapter. The portion on the right is from verse 2, and it reads, Maliki Nas, the ruler of mankind. Now, I'm not really going to be looking at this verse in this video, but it will have some minor relevance towards the end. My main focus is going to be on the portion on the left, which is the third verse, which reads, Ilahin Nas, the God of mankind. I'll be comparing this Quranic text to what appears on the particular pew we are examining in the video. So, returning to the pew, I'd like to first look closely at this portion here. Kelly Richardson felt that there's a clean break between two characters here, but I see markings in between the portions he proposed. Being that he referenced alleged tools which were used, assuming for the sake of argument that these are, man-made markings, I'm happy to say that maybe the person making these markings might have had to employ multiple strokes, but that does not seem obvious to me as obviously ruling out the possibility that it was intended as part of a continuous flow. In other words, this portion here could have been intended as a continuous flow, even if multiple strokes were used to ultimately put that flow together. With that in mind, I do see a clean break here. You have this portion that hooks upward, and then there's sort of a dot above that hook. So with that in mind, pulling back, this portion here looks to me like an Arabic nun alif. It looks like a sort of hook, but with a dot above the shorter portion. And when looking at the Quranic text that we pulled up, a nun alif appears right here. Returning to the pew, the next portion I would like to focus on is the portion on the left, which is one of the portions that Richardson ignored. Notice this portion here sort of goes downward, then raises up a little bit, then drops a bit again and rises again, almost as if it's forming something like a W. Can you see that? As we pull back now, notice that portion that it also has another part that hooks off dramatically to the left. And therefore, I would propose that this looks like an Arabic final scene. And as we return to our Quranic verse, we find precisely that character, Arabic character scene, final scene specifically, in that, basically that same spot. And this gives us the Arabic word nas, which means mankind. In my first video on a hypothetical case for Arabic on this pew, I also showed this calligraphic form of the name of the chapter, Surat an-Nas, and I highlighted the word nas in that as well for the sake of comparison. So one of the portions that Kelly Richardson wanted to ignore actually looks like an Arabic character and fits very well with an Arabic interpretation of this pew. The next portion that I'd like to focus on is this line here, as it is to the right of the portion that Richardson proposed was a yod. So this is another portion that Kelly Richardson wanted to ignore. Here I would propose that this looks a bit like an Arabic alif. Returning to the Quranic text, we find an alif in this position here. Now, the next portion I want to look at on the pew is this portion right here. Kelly Richardson had proposed that this portion has 4 characters within it, Yod, Zayin, Resh, Yod, and in specifically the Solitreo script. In my first video on a hypothetical case for Arabic in this pew, I showed this calligraphic rendering of the same chapter, and I noted that the word ilah is rendered like this, with that hook on the top right. So in the Quranic text we have been looking at, I would propose that this could correspond to this portion here, where you see the arrow pointing to. This portion is actually 2 characters, lam, ha. I'd propose here that the hook in the corresponding marking on the pew could just be a more dramatic rendering of the lam in lam ha. As I said before, if we assume this is a man-made mark, the person who made it might have had to use multiple strokes to make this continuous flow of 2 characters, lam ha, but it seems to provide an easy explanation of why there isn't a clean break between what Kelly Richardson wanted to interpret as multiple separate characters. Multiple separate Hebrew characters, that is. In Arabic, multiple characters can form a continuous flow. So on this interpretation, we now have 2 words. On the right, we have alif lam ha, spelling the word ilah, which means God. On the left, we have nun alif sin, spelling the word nas, which means mankind. But what about those 2 lines right in between those 2 words? Well, returning to the Quranic text, the only portion that has not been highlighted in the verse is, well, in specifically verse 3, is precisely the 2 lines between the word ilah and the word nas. This portion here, 2 lines forming the definite article, alif, lam. So on the pew, I'm going to highlight those 2 little lines and interpret them as an alif lam, the definite article on the word nas, forming the word an-nas, the mankind, the humanity. So now we have the full Quranic verse reading ilahin nas, the God of mankind. And at this point, those familiar with Arabic will be within their rights to note that that's a very short alif and lam in what's being proposed as the definite article for an-nas. For that reason, this would probably be it's probably the most curious portion of this interpretation of the pew. But remember that Richardson was proposing that these allegedly man-made markings were made specifically by slaves. You see, the pews were built by slaves, and it's claimed that the same slaves who built the pews also made the markings on the pews. Now, assuming that's true, with that in mind, I'd like to turn to this document, which is currently displayed at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll share a link in the video description. This is a text which a slave in Haiti wrote in the 1700s. What you see here was the slave's attempt to write the Arabic text of the 112th chapter of the Qur'an from memory. Now, this is helpful because not only because it's, an example of Arabic written by a slave in the Americas, but more specifically because it's from the shorter, easier to memorize suwar or chapters at the end of the Qur'an. See, I'm proposing a hypothetical case for a portion of the 114th chapter of the Quran on the relevant pew, and here we see the 112th chapter of the Quran. Both these chapters are part of a collection of very short chapters at the end of the Quran, which many Muslims find relatively easy to memorize. Moreover, this text shows a real-world example of how, when a slave in the Americas wrote one of those shorter Quranic chapters from memory, there could arise, I'll try to put this delicately, there could arise curious features that might strike a student of Arabic as respectfully perhaps being indicative of the writer not being fully attentive to the alifs and lams in the text that they were attempting to reproduce from memory. First, note that in the basmala, the word Allah is missing a lam. It's spelled alif lam ha rather than alif lam lam ha, with two lams. In fact, every single time the word Allah appears in this text, it's spelled this way, as you'll see as we go through it. Also note that the alif and lam in Allah here are shorter than the ba, which begins the basmala. As we move more into the text, note that the alif in the definite articles of both Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim are not visible, seemingly sublimated into the lams of those titles. Then, as we move beyond the basmala into the first verse of the chapter, note that the word ahad does not have a visible alif, and I'd propose that the same is the case when the word ahad appears again at the end of this chapter in this particular rendering. So moving on to the next verse, the lam in as-samad is part of the definite article in as-samad is not visible. Perhaps it's been sublimated into the character sad. Now after that phrase, Allah as-samad, the text becomes less clear, but I'd like to jump to the last verse, or better put, the fourth verse, which reads, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. On a side note, it's curious that both yakun and kufua seem to be spelled with a qaf rather than a kaf, but I want to focus on the word lahu. Notice how short the lam is in lahu. It is very, very short. And meanwhile, the lam at the start of the verse is dramatically long. The point of this look at the text is to note that we have a real-world example of a slave in the Americas writing one of the shorter suwar from the end of the Qur'an and from memory. And we see that when this happened, the approach to specifically alifs and lams does not always seem consistent, or, because it has different lengths and perhaps even different styles at different points. So returning to the pew we were looking at, yes, on this proposed reading, the alif lam of the definite article for an-nas is very short. But we also know that this phenomenon would not be unprecedented for slaves in the Americas writing shorter Quranic suwar from memory. That said, there's still a portion on this pew that we have not addressed, and that's the portion here on the right, which Kelly Richardson also tried to ignore. This raises a question. If the markings highlighted in red produce the Quranic phrase ilahin nas, what is this marking to the right of that phrase? Well, returning to our Quranic text, note what precedes the verse we've been looking at, which is to say, we've been looking at verse 3. However, recall that verse 2 reads Malikin Nas, which is to say it also ends with the word an-nas, which ends with an Arabic final scene. With that in mind, let's take another look at the marking on the right of the pew. It does indeed look like an Arabic final scene. Now, think about the implications of this. If my proposed reading of the portion that Kelly Richardson looked at is correct, we could even expect that portion to be flanked by the letter sin on both sides. And lo and behold, The very markings that Kelly Richardson wanted to ignore look precisely like instances of the Arabic letter sin. Honestly, that's an amazing coincidence. More importantly, however, my proposed interpretation of this pew can explain precisely the portions that Richardson's approach had to avoid. Beyond that, the string of characters I have proposed is extremely well attested. It's from one of the most well-known and most memorized Arabic texts in human history. Meanwhile, the string of characters Kelly Richardson proposed seems completely ahistorical. I doubt anyone can find that string of characters in any text. Now, at this point, Richardson or maybe one of his supporters might feel tempted to say, whoa, hold on just a minute. That string of characters was ran through an online translator and got back a translation. I've explained how that translation app works in previous videos, and I think Kelly Richardson saw those videos. Nonetheless, I'll explain it again here. The relevant translation site is at doitinhebrew.com, and when you use their site, if you enter an actual Hebrew term, the site will give you back a long, complex answer pulling entries from multiple sources. However, if you enter a string of characters which does not form a known Hebrew term, the answer section will be empty, save for a single guess made by the site. And the site makes its guesses by trying to ignore certain characters and trying to insert others, and, all within a fraction of a second. But the salient point is that if you get back an otherwise empty answer section, save for the site's guess, that means the string of characters you entered is a Hebrew term not known by any of the site's various sources. And that's significant. But let's see some examples, and then we'll take a closer look at the precise string of characters that Kelly Richardson wanted to propose. First, I'm going to enter the nun het, the characters nun het, which is how you spell the name Noah in Hebrew. And as you see, we get a complex set of answers, which the site pulls from multiple sources. Now, let's change that to nun het het. So there's two hets. This is not a coherent Hebrew term. And notice this answer section from here is also empty. All one finds at the top is the guess, which is still Noah, as the site, in an attempt to find something similar, ignored one of the hets in the string of characters we entered. Now, for a second example, I'll enter yod het yod he, which spells yihyeh, which means he or it masculine will live. And we see that for this verb, we get a complex set of answers when we run it through the translation site. But now I'm going to go back up and enter something completely crazy. Yod chet lamed yod wa chet chet, which is complete gibberish. That is not coherent Hebrew in the least, yet the site ignores several characters and comes up with a guess, but notice that the answer section is otherwise empty. That's the important thing to understand. Kelly Richardson, he misrepresented me and claimed that I called the site unreliable. However, I never said that. I have only argued that one has to understand how this site works. If multiple, let me put it this way. If what you enter is meaningful Hebrew, the site will give back a complex set of answers. And it pulls, those answers from multiple sources. However, when you enter something ahistorical or incoherent, that answer section will be empty. The site is still going to give back something as an approximation, or in worst case scenarios, at least a phonetic transcription into Latin characters. But when the answer section is otherwise empty, that means that the string of characters you entered is unknown to the site's various sources. So with that in mind, let's enter the word Yisrael, or Israel, which is properly spelled Yod Sin Dreish Alef Lamed. So clicking that, we see that the site gives a complex set of answers. But now let's enter the string of characters that Kelly Richardson proposed, which is Yod Zayin Resh Yod 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 Lamed. Yes, the guess, the approximation based on ignoring or importing characters within a fraction of a second is Israel. But notice that the answer section is once again completely empty. That section is empty because the string of characters which Richardson proposed is completely ahistorical. So to close out this video, let's note some of the strengths of my hypothetical Arabic interpretation of the relevant pew, as contrasted with the weaknesses of Kelly Richardson's Solitreo Hebrew interpretation of the same pew. First, the Arabic interpretation of the pew explains most of the markings. It explained almost every mark on that pew, whereas Kelly Richardson's approach has to ignore most of the markings. He literally tried to avoid more than half of the markings on the pew he was interpreting. Second, the Arabic interpretation of the pew produces a coherent phrase, whereas Kelly Richardson's approach offered a single word, and that one word strains credulity. It's hard to take seriously. Third, the Arabic interpretation of the pew produces a phrase which is well attested in historical Arabic literature. It's a phrase from the Qur'an, the most well-known work in all of Arabic literature. Meanwhile, Kelly Richardson's string of characters seems to lack any textual witness. It seems completely ahistorical. Finally, fourth, the phrase produced by the Arabic interpretation of the pew is from the shorter suwar at the end of the Qur'an, and we have evidence of slaves in the Americas writing parts of those suwar from memory. Meanwhile, I seriously doubt that Kelly Richardson can find his proposed term in any corpus, much less any known any known slaves. Now, for the 13-month period between October of 2019 and November of 2020, I repeatedly said that whatever the weakness of my hypothetical case for Arabic on that pew, I nonetheless made a stronger case for Arabic than any case that had been made for Hebrew. That upset Kelly Richardson, but it was said because during that time period, no one had ever made a public attempt to, transcribe what they think appears on the pews. But since November, a few people have made attempts to propose Hebrew on the pews, Benaiah Israel being the first, and for that reason I continue to respect the paradigm shift he ushered in. But even now, when comparing my latest Arabic interpretation of this particular pew to Kelly Richardson's Solitreo Hebrew interpretation of the pew, we can still honestly say that a stronger case has been made for Arabic than has been made for Hebrew. One side is proposing a coherent, well-attested historical Arabic phrase, while the other is proposing a single, barely coherent historical word. Now, at this point, I imagine someone will want to ask if any scholars back this Arabic interpretation of this pew. My answer is I'll cover that in my next video on appeals to scholars, where we will also look at Kelly Richardson and his team's appeal to a new scholar. But for now, permit me to again put up the disclaimer that however strong this video's case for Arabic might seem, I'm still not definitively claiming that there is any language on this pew. This was, as I repeatedly said, a hypothetical case for Arabic. I do believe there's something to be said about a creative mind's ability to see patterns that are not actually present, based on, familiar features and familiar, as I said, patterns. On that note, I'll close here. I definitely look forward to the comments of others. God bless.